Uwe, Paul, it's a pleasure again to be here. Ambassador Shedevy, thank you. Good to be with you. Excellency, my colleagues who are here from the embassy, and friends and ladies and gentlemen. The theme that has been chosen for the 14th Berlin Security Conference, Euro-Atlantic Partnership, Firm Anchor in a Turbulent World, is aptly descriptive of the current state of world affairs. And there is no better illustration of that firm anchor than the solidarity that the Euro-Atlantic community has expressed with France during these past few days in the aftermath of the horrific tragedy in Paris. It is an understatement to say that today we are facing a world of remarkable complexity. At the advent of a new century, much was written about interconnectedness being the dominant characteristic of our time. Well, in the decade and a half since, the world has become flatter, more connected, and even more interdependent. Not a day goes by when we don't see how challenges in one part of the world impact people's lives in another due to shifting strategic, political, and economic relationships, not to mention the transformative effect of technology. On the one hand, our increasing interconnectedness has helped to fuel economic growth, allowed for the creation of new businesses and even new industries, and has sparked social and political change. Think for a minute about the role that Twitter played in the Arab Spring or on the Maidan. There is, however, a pervasive unease, a sense that the very forces that have brought our 24/7 world closer together and created enormous opportunities have also unleashed dangers that threaten to drive us apart. Terrorism, the use of technology to radicalize and recruit extremists and to plan attacks, extreme nationalism, conflicts over resources driven by population shifts and climate change, and great disparities in economic and social opportunity, which are made all the more apparent by the pervasiveness of technology. I often think of the issues that we confront today that were not even on our radar screen when I arrived in Berlin over 2 years ago. The Russian incursion into the Ukraine and annexation of Crimea. The war in Syria with the use of chemical weapons and barrel bombs by a leader against his own people. The brutality of ISIL in Syria, Iraq, Northern Africa, and of course now Europe itself. And the metastasizing of terrorism into the West in the form of foreign fighters. The return of the Taliban into certain parts of Afghanistan. The opportunity, on the positive side, to prevent, through diplomatic means, Iran from ever obtaining a nuclear weapon. The threat of Ebola and the need to rebuild the public health infrastructure of West Africa, the impact of the Greek economy on the Eurozone as a whole, the threat to our governments and our economies and our societies of increasingly sophisticated cyber attacks, the dangers of a changing climate, and of course, the greatest movement of refugees through Europe since the Second World War. So how do we get our arms around all of this? Fundamentally, by strengthening our partnership and by working together. During the 70 years since the end of World War II, the 60 years since the western part of a divided Germany entered NATO, and the 25 years since the reunification of Germany, the transatlantic alliance was made strong by a diplomacy that balanced both interests and principles. It was built on the understanding that a rules and values-based international order was mutually beneficial to all. And it was made possible because of our shared interests, shared history, and shared sacrifices. But as I have learned in my discussions with young people here in Germany, who came of age after the fall of the wall, iconic events during that time, such as the Luftbrücke, Ich bin ein Berliner, tear down this wall, and reunification are ancient history for them. Their generation is confronted with new challenges, and young people in particular are quite skeptical of the ability of large institutions to solve them. Notwithstanding that skepticism, without a doubt, a strong, deep transatlantic relationship is as important today as ever. As New York Times columnist Thomas Frieden has written, we are confronting a struggle today between the world of order and the world of disorder. The challenges I just cited not only threaten the governing principles of international order and a global rules-based system, they are also fundamentally changing the security parameters of our world. Now, we've spent a lot of time today discussing the threat of terrorism, the crisis in Ukraine, and the war in Syria. But let me give you three aspects of our collective security interests that we also must address. They are cybersecurity, cyber stability, climate control, and trade and investment. First, let's consider the need for cyber stability. The past 2 years have seen sophisticated cyber attacks on the Bundestag and the Chancellery, the State Department and the United States Office of Personnel Management, and in the business world, most famously, on Sony Pictures Entertainment. And if press accounts are correct, it appears that these attacks came from 3 different countries. And that's not the least of it. We now live in a world where non-state actors attempt on a daily basis to attack and disrupt our financial, air traffic control, and energy grid systems. Ensuring international cyber stability is essential to the functioning of our economies and to our collective national security interests. And yet it is still very much a work in progress. The first step is to create an environment in which all states are able to enjoy the benefits of cyberspace, but are incentivized to cooperate and avoid conflict and are deterred from attacking one another. Fundamentally, digital policy should fulfill technology's potential as a vehicle for global stability and sustained economic development. It should enhance the transparency of governments and hold governments and their leaders accountable. It should enable social empowerment through what is possibly the most democratic form of public expression ever invented. Even in the poorest places on the planet, where running water and electricity are hardly givens, people possess smartphones which give them access to people, to ideas, and to goods and services. At its best, the internet is an equal opportunity platform from which the voice of a student can have as much reach as that of a billionaire. Or a chief executive may be able to learn something from an entry-level employee. The internet revolution is literally defining and creating opportunities for young people around the world. And this potential is truly exciting. But it is crucial that we understand how technology is used and carefully consider how its use must be governed. The danger posed by those with ill intent grows worse every year, threatening government agencies, banks, retailers, journalists, and potentially critical mechanical systems in dams, power plants, and aircraft. As such, digital technology has led us into a whole new frontier that we have to navigate. Beyond that, it can also be used, as we have seen, to radicalize and recruit extremists, to emulate, inspire, and motivate acts of terrorism, and to spread propaganda and distort the dissemination of facts. One thing is certain: as a first step, the basic rules of international law have got to apply in cyberspace. Acts of aggression cannot be permitted, and countries that are harmed by an attack must have the right to respond in ways that are appropriate, proportional, and that minimize harm to innocent parties. To spell this out, specific rules should include the following. First, no country should conduct or knowingly support online activity that intentionally damages or impedes the use of another country's critical infrastructure. Second, no country should seek either to prevent emergency teams from responding to a cybersecurity incident or to allow its own teams to cause harm. Third, no country should conduct or support cyber-enabled theft of intellectual property, trade secrets, or other confidential business information for commercial gain. Fourth, every country should mitigate malicious cyber activity emanating from its soil, and they should do so in an accountable and cooperative manner. And finally, every country should do what it can to help states that are victimized by a cyber attack. If these 5 principles are genuinely and fully adopted and implemented, we can live in a far safer and a far more confident cyber world, and then we can turn our collective attention to non-state cyber actors as well. This is why the United States considers the promotion of an open and secure internet to be a key component of our foreign policy. It's why we are working with international partners in order to better understand the choices that we face in managing this extraordinary resource without adopting rules that choke the economic lifeblood of the digital revolution. For example, in September, when China's President Xi visited the White House, President Obama raised serious concerns about growing cyber threats to American companies and American citizens. And as a result, the 2 countries reached common understanding on the way forward. Neither government would conduct or knowingly support cyber-enabled theft of intellectual property, and with the intent of providing competitive advantages to their companies. In addition, the 2 leaders agreed to work together with other nations to promote appropriate rules of the road for cyber conduct. Now, that work is not done, but progress was made and will continue to be made. That same spirit of cooperation is accelerating momentum in the second area that I want to stress, namely the need to create a low-carbon economy. We are on the cusp of whole new industries and applications in wind and solar power, energy-efficient vehicles, conservation, and biofuels. Scientific cooperation and technology sharing agreements in these fields have become a major part of our diplomacy. America is pursuing ambitious reductions in our carbon emissions, and we've increased our investments in clean energy. We will do our part, and we will work to avoid the north-south divide that has hampered past climate summits by helping developing nations to do their part. But the science tells us that we can only succeed in combating climate change if we are joined in this effort by every single nation. I spoke earlier about addressing the concerns of the generation that were born after the fall or around the fall of the wall. Well, those in that age bracket have never lived with a single month, not one month, that was cooler than the average of any identical month in the last century. Every successive year since then has been announced as the hottest year on record. And we're seeing the results in drought, in violent storms, and in melting glaciers. But climate change is not only a threat to the environment, it is a threat to stability and to the security of nations throughout the world. The impacts of climate change can intensify resource competition, threaten livelihoods, and increase the risk of instability and conflict, especially in places that are already suffering from economic, political, or social stress. And because in today's world is so extraordinarily interconnected, instability anywhere can be a threat to security everywhere. Moreover, climate change is a threat multiplier. It makes worse problems that already exist. A brief example is in Nigeria. Now, climate change obviously did not lead to the rise of the terrorist group Boko Haram, but the severe drought that country suffered and the government's inability to cope with it helped to create the political and economic volatility that the militants exploited. A recent study indicated, and I quote, that the combination of high temperatures and humidity could, within just a century, result in extreme conditions in the Persian Gulf that are intolerable to human beings if climate change continues unabated. Scholars suggest that access to air conditioning could well mean the difference between life and death in such hotspots as Kuwait, Qatar, and the UAE. And the prospect of a hotter, drier climate throughout the Middle East and parts of Asia will place even more strain on that most precious and essential resource of all, fresh water. We've seen wars over oil. We do not need to see wars over water. Beyond that, the refugee situation we're facing today will pale in comparison to the mass migrations that intense droughts, sea level rise, and other impacts of climate change are likely to bring about. In other words, we have got to integrate climate considerations into every single aspect of our foreign policy, from development and humanitarian aid to peace building and diplomacy. In that regard, a year ago in Beijing, President Obama and Chinese President Xi made an historic announcement of the intended targets of both countries. For the first time, you had China committing to cap carbon emissions, and President Obama at the same time unveiled a plan for much deeper cuts in American emissions. These are the two largest economies in the world, the biggest energy consumers, and candidly, the biggest carbon emitters, but they cross traditional divides to demonstrate their commitment to reducing the emissions warming our planet, and at the same time, by their action, urged other world leaders to follow suit. The United States is fully engaged, as is Germany, in efforts to deliver a strong agreement in Paris this December that will launch a major climate effort for decades to come, putting the world on a path to a low-carbon, sustainable global economy. This is an area where we have got to continue to build momentum. And finally, we also need to build momentum when it comes to the third point I raised, our ongoing trade negotiations. The Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership Agreement, or TTIP, represents ideas that were put in practice in the early years after the end of World War II, when the leaders of the United States and Europe formed a partnership that was based upon the premise that if Europe prospers, America does so as well, and vice versa. That logic of a mutually beneficial partnership continues to make eminent sense from both an economic and a collective security standpoint. On both sides of the Atlantic, it is important that we strengthen our economies by ensuring long-term stability. TTIP will provide an economic and a strategic framework that can serve as the foundation for our shared prosperity well into this century. It will deepen our cooperation and thereby keep trade running efficiently and growing. It is the next step in a strong relationship between equal partners. When the TTIP negotiations were launched 2 years ago, we knew that they would present great opportunities and also a few challenges. And candidly, after 11 rounds of negotiations, we've seen both. Today, in my opinion, the opportunities are even more obvious. Yet the public debate over TTIP, in particular here in Germany, has been dominated by generalized fears about globalization rather than by the realities of free and fair trade. Well, guess what, folks? Globalization is happening. And it is driven not only by technology, but fundamentally by the aspirations of people around the world for a better life. Remember what I said earlier about the prevalence of smartphones in the least developed countries in the world? At literally any moment in time, anywhere on Earth, people can find partners and competitors, they can find allies and adversaries Globalization is a reality of our world, and TTIP is actually an opportunity to manage the impact of globalization. We can mitigate globalization's downside by enacting and implementing standards and regulations that simultaneously protect people against abuse and exploitation and address their hopes and aspirations. TTIP promotes the tenets of an open trading system, open markets, rule of law, intellectual property right protection, transparency in our commercial dealings, high standards for consumer health and safety, and respect for both the environment and for working men and women. These principles are also the focal point of the recently concluded Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. In Asia, the rules of the road in many cases are up for grabs, but under TPP, for the first time in history, tough, fully enforceable standards will protect workers' rights and the environments. And in terms of high standards, TTIP will be an agreement between the two most highly regulated economies on the planet. And their political leaders have absolutely no intention of approving an agreement that is going to reduce those high standards. Unfortunately, TTIP proponents lost the first round of framing the public discussions here in Germany. And not because we lost a battle of ideas, but candidly, because we were very late in even showing up. Now, I often talk about TTIP, but let's face it, as the American ambassador who represents the folks on the other side of the negotiating table, I'm maybe not the most effective advocate for TTIP in Europe. Fundamentally, Europeans need to hear from Europeans about how increased trade and investment with the United States will positively impact their lives, not just statistically, but tangibly in their communities. They need to hear what TTIP is and what it is not. And they deserve a balanced discussion, not the one-sided fear-mongering that they have thus far been treated to. The fact is, TTIP will boost exports. It will support jobs and advance a pro-growth agenda in Europe. And at a time when much of the EU is struggling economically, facing not only stratospherically high youth unemployment, but also now a migration crisis of historic dimensions, TTIP would be a jobs package that is virtually cost-free. Ironically, this debate is also taking place at a time when Western values, such as rule of law, human rights, and open markets, the backbone of the world order that our citizens cherish, are being challenged on many fronts. With TTIP, we have the opportunity to reinforce those values, to be standard setters rather than standard takers, and to build an economic and a strategic framework that can serve as the foundation for shared prosperity and for our shared security well into the coming century. One last point. There's an opportunity for us to conclude TTIP prior to the end of the Obama presidency, which is January of 2017, January 20th of 2017. But if we do not do that, there are some realities that we have to consider. A new president may or may not support TTIP. And if you're paying attention to the election campaign going on across the Atlantic, several of them don't. He or she will then, let's assume it's a supporter of TTIP, he or she will end up appointing their economic team. And then they're going to have to get that team confirmed by the Senate. And then that team's going to appoint their deputies, and they have to get confirmed by the Senate. Then everybody has to sit down and reach agreement about their economic priorities. And then, since when you negotiate a trade agreement, nothing is agreed upon until everything is agreed upon, they may well want to reopen issues or chapters that we all thought had been completely settled. And then politics intercedes. You have the French elections. You have the German elections. You have the EU elections and the formation of a new commission. So fundamentally, President Obama is determined to continue negotiating as long as he is in office, and there will be no slowdown in that process as a consequence of the presidential campaign. But there is no question that, as stated in the G7 communique, we have got to accelerate the negotiating process if we're going to get this thing done. In closing, by choosing to build on our rules-based international order and strengthening our alliances and partnerships for the 21st century, we can better meet the myriad challenges of our times. If we lift our eyes beyond our borders, if we think globally and we act cooperatively, we can shape the course of this century, just as our predecessors shaped the era after the Second World War. But in order to successfully address each of the challenges that I've described, cybersecurity, climate control, and trade and investment, we have got to have the focus, the support, and the collaboration of the transatlantic partners. And with that, we can truly be that firm anchor in a turbulent world. Thank you very, very much.